Every man deserves a second chance, but not every man gets a four-legged angel to help him find it. This is the story of how one golden retriever changed everything for a man the world had written off. At 52, McKenzie walks rescue dogs through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, his faded Hell's Angels tattoos telling a story most people prefer to avoid. His only true companion is Daisy, a golden retriever who seems to understand him better than any human ever has. On a Tuesday morning that starts like any other, a runaway truck barrels toward a school crossing where a child stands frozen in fear. Razor doesn't think twice about throwing himself into danger to save the boy, but the police who arrive see his ink, not his heroism. As three officers draw their weapons on the man they recognize as trouble, Daisy steps between them, her gentle presence challenging everything they think they know about redemption. Would this moment of grace finally heal a 20-year wound? Between father and daughter? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through the pre-dawn darkness of McKenzie's one-bedroom apartment at 5:30 sharp, same as it had every morning for the past 3 years. He reached over with a calloused hand, silencing the noise before it could wake the golden retriever curled at the foot of his bed. Daisy's tail gave a sleepy thump against the worn comforter, acknowledging his movement without lifting her graying muzzle from her paws. Razor swung his legs over the side of the narrow mattress, his bare feet finding the cold hardwood floor. At 52, his body carried the accumulated weight of 5 decades lived hard. Old knife wounds that ached in the rain, knuckles that had been broken more times than he could count, and a left shoulder that never quite sat right after a motorcycle accident in '98. But it was the faded black ink covering his forearms that told the real story. The one most people couldn't look past. The skull and crossbones stretched across his right forearm had been his first, gotten when he was barely 19 and thought the world owed him something. Below it, Gothic letters spelled out Hell's Angels in Old English script, surrounded by flames and wings that had once been sharp and bold, but now blurred at the edges like old memories. His left arm bore the marks of his rise through the ranks, a death's head with glowing red eyes, motorcycle wheels with chains, and at the center of it all, the number 81 that marked him as a full-patch member of the most feared motorcycle club in America. But that was another life, another man. The Razor, who had earned those tattoos with blood and violence, was as dead as the brothers he'd buried along the way. What remained was a man who woke before dawn to care for animals nobody else wanted. The Cedar Falls Animal Shelter sat on the outskirts of town, a converted warehouse that had once housed farm equipment but now provided refuge for the county's unwanted dogs and cats. Razor had been walking there every morning for 3 years, arriving before the staff to let the dogs out and begin the long process of giving each one the attention they craved. The shelter's director, Sarah Chen, had taken a chance on him when no one else would. An act of faith that still humbled him every morning when he unlocked the front door with the key she'd entrusted to his scarred hands. "Morning, babies," he said softly as he flipped on the fluorescent lights in the kennel area. Immediately, the space erupted in a chorus of barks, whines, and tail thumping as 37 dogs recognized the voice that meant breakfast, walks, and the kind of gentle attention most of them had never known before coming here. Daisy trotted beside him as he moved from kennel to kennel, greeting each animal by name. There was Chester, a pit bull mix who'd been abandoned in a parking lot with a chain embedded in his neck. Luna, a shepherd collie cross who'd spent 2 years tied to a tree in someone's backyard before a neighbor finally called animal control. Romeo, a beagle whose owner had surrendered him after deciding a new baby made a dog too much work. Each dog had a story, and Razor knew them all. He'd learned that the key to healing, both for the animals and for himself, was in the daily. Ritual of care. Feed them at the same time each morning. Clean their spaces with quiet efficiency. Spend time with each one, letting them know they mattered. It was simple work, but it was honest work, and honesty had been in short supply during his previous life. The memories came anyway, as they always did in the quiet moments between tasks. 25 years with the Angels, starting as a prospect, who'd do anything to earn his colors, and ending as an enforcer who'd done things that still woke him in cold sweats. The clubhouse in Oakland, where he'd learned that loyalty meant never asking questions and never backing down. The runs where grown men had trembled when they saw his bike in their rearview mirror. The night in Stockton, when everything went wrong, and the sirens finally caught up with him. 7 years in San Quentin had given him plenty of time to think about the choices he'd made, but it was the letter he'd never opened, the one from his daughter Emma that had arrived 6 months into. His sentence that haunted him most. She would have been 12 then, old enough to understand why Daddy wasn't coming home for Christmas or birthdays or any of the moments that mattered. Old enough to hate him for choosing the brotherhood over his own blood. You're thinking too. Hard again. Razor looked up to find Sarah Chen standing in the doorway of the kennel, coffee in hand, and that knowing smile she wore when she caught him lost in the past. At 38, she was young enough to be his daughter, but she carried herself with the authority of someone who'd learned early that the world didn't give you anything you didn't fight for. She'd built this shelter from nothing, funded it with a combination of grants, donations, and her own teacher's salary, turning it into the kind of place where broken things, dogs and people alike, could find a second chance. Just running through. The morning routine, he said, scratching Luna behind the ears as the shepherd mix pressed against the kennel door. Uh-huh. Sarah took a sip of her coffee, studying him with the same careful attention she gave to animals who were trying to hide. Their pain. The board meeting is tomorrow night. You know they're going to bring up the Henderson complaint again. The Hendersons lived 3 blocks from the shelter in one of Cedar Falls' newer subdivisions, where the houses had perfect lawns and the homeowners association had opinions about property values. Mrs. Henderson had made it clear from day one that having an ex-convict walking dogs through their neighborhood made her uncomfortable, and she'd been vocal about it at every town hall meeting since. I can find another route, Razor offered. Though they both knew that wasn't what Mrs. Henderson really wanted. She wanted him gone entirely, wanted the shelter to hire someone whose past wouldn't make the evening news if anyone bothered to look into it. You'll do no such thing. Sarah's voice carried the steel that had helped her stand up to the county commissioners when they'd tried to shut down the shelter last year. Those dogs need their exercise and you need yours. Besides, most of the neighborhood loves seeing you with them. Mrs. Patterson told me yesterday that watching you with Romeo was the highlight of her morning. It was true that the response hadn't been entirely negative. There were people like Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who'd started leaving dog treats on her porch for Razor to find during his walks. The Martinez family had invited him in for coffee once, when a sudden rainstorm caught him and his pack of 4 dogs without shelter. Even some of the police officers who patrolled the area had gotten used to seeing him, nodding respectfully when they passed instead of pulling him over to run his license. But there were still the others, the ones who crossed to the other side of the street when they saw him coming, who made sure their children were inside when the dangerous man with the tattoos walked by. Razor understood their caution, even if it stung. He'd been one of the dangerous ones once. And changing your life didn't erase the reasons people had to fear you. The board meeting will be fine, Sarah continued, though Razor caught the slight tension in her voice that suggested she was less confident than she sounded. Dr. Williams and Pastor Martinez have both said they'll speak for you. And the adoption numbers don't lie. We've placed more animals in the past 3 years than in the previous 10 combined. It was true. There was something about watching Razor, 6'2", covered in intimidating ink, hands that had once been weapons, gently coax a traumatized dog back to trust that resonated with potential adopters. If this giant of a man with his violent past could show such tenderness, surely they could find room in their hearts for a rescue animal. The morning routine continued with the practiced efficiency of long habit. Dogs were fed, kennels cleaned, medications distributed to those who needed them. Razor worked mostly in silence, letting the rhythm of the work quiet the restless energy that always seemed to simmer just beneath his carefully controlled surface. Daisy moved through it all like a furry supervisor, greeting volunteers as they arrived, settling nervous dogs with her calm presence, and somehow knowing exactly when Razor needed the comfort of her solid warmth against his leg. By 8 o'clock, the shelter was fully operational. Volunteers arrived to help with the animals, potential adopters began browsing the kennels, and Sarah disappeared into her office to wrestle with the endless paperwork that kept the place running. Razor gathered the leads for his morning pack. Today it would be Daisy, Romeo, Chester, and a nervous border collie named Faith, who was just beginning to trust human touch again. The route took them through the residential streets that bordered the shelter, past the neat houses where people were getting their children ready for school and heading off to jobs that didn't require them to explain their past to everyone they met. It was peaceful work, watching the dogs discover the world beyond kennel walls, seeing their personalities emerge as they gained confidence in their temporary freedom. But as Razor watched Chester sniff hopefully at a fence post while Romeo investigated something fascinating in the gutter, he couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming. The board meeting tomorrow night would determine whether he could continue this work that had become more than a job. It had become his redemption. And somewhere out there, in a world he'd voluntarily cut himself off from, was a daughter who probably still carried the letter he'd never had the courage to open, wondering if her father had ever been worth the love she'd once given so freely. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the early autumn air and catching the gold in Daisy's coat as she trotted contentedly at his side. Whatever was coming, Razor knew he'd face it the same way he'd learned to face everything in this new life, one day at a time, with quiet dignity and the unshakable belief that even the most broken things could be made whole again if someone was patient enough to love them back to life. The morning had started no different from hundreds of others. Razor walked his usual route through the tree-lined streets of Cedar Falls, 4 dogs trotting contentedly beside him in the crisp October air. Chester had finally stopped pulling at his leash. Romeo was investigating every interesting scent. With scientific precision, Faith was gaining confidence with each step, and Daisy moved through it all with the serene authority of a dog who understood her place in the world. They were approaching the intersection at Maple and 3rd, where the elementary school's crossing guard would soon be positioning herself for the morning rush of children, when Razor noticed the delivery truck parked halfway up the block. The driver was wrestling with a hand truck loaded with boxes, his attention focused on maneuvering the unwieldy cargo down the vehicle's ramp. The dogs sensed the change in Razor's posture before he was fully conscious of it himself. Daisy's head came up, her ears pricked forward in that way that meant she was reading something in the environment that required attention. Chester stopped his casual sniffing and moved closer to Razor's leg. Even Romeo, normally oblivious to anything that didn't directly involve food or belly rubs, seemed to pick up on the tension. That's when Razor saw the child. A boy, maybe 7 years old, had dropped his backpack in the crosswalk and was crouched down, frantically trying to stuff escaped papers back inside, while his lunchbox lay open beside him, contents scattered across the asphalt. The crossing guard was still 50 yards away, dealing with a group of older kids who were walking to school in the opposite direction. The boy was alone in the street, focused entirely on salvaging his homework, completely unaware of the delivery truck that was now rolling backward down the slight incline. The driver was still at the rear of the vehicle, fighting with his hand truck. He couldn't see the boy, couldn't hear the child's frustrated sighs over the rumble of the diesel engine. The truck's backup beeper had apparently been broken for some time, because there was no warning sound as the massive vehicle gained momentum. On its path toward the crosswalk, Razor dropped the leashes. Later, witnesses would disagree about exactly how fast everything happened. Some would say it was over in seconds. Others would swear it took forever, like watching a movie in slow motion. But for Razor, time moved with the crystalline clarity that had once made him dangerous in a different kind of emergency. He was running before he'd made the conscious decision to move, his body remembering the explosive speed that had once served him in situations where hesitation meant death. The child looked up just as Razor reached the edge of the crosswalk, his young face shifting from concentration to confusion as this large, tattooed stranger bore down on him at full sprint. Razor scooped the boy up in one fluid motion, gathering both child and scattered belongings as he pivoted hard to the left. The truck's bumper missed them by inches, the whoosh of displaced air ruffling the boy's hair as the vehicle finally came to a stop against the curb where a fire hydrant stood. Like a small yellow sentinel. "Hey there, partner," Razor said, setting the child down on the sidewalk with gentle hands. "You okay?" The boy nodded, too stunned to speak, clutching his rescued backpack against his chest while staring up at the man who'd just saved his life. Up close, the tattoos were impossible to ignore. The skull and wings, the Gothic lettering, the symbols that most people associated with violence and lawlessness. But the hands that had grabbed him had been careful, protective, and the voice was soft with genuine concern. "My papers," the boy said finally, looking back toward the street where his homework was still scattered. "Don't worry about that," Razor said, already moving to gather the wayward sheets. "We'll get everything picked up." That's when he heard the sirens. Someone had called 911, whether for the near accident or simply because they'd seen a large man with obvious gang tattoos grab a child. Razor couldn't be sure. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers had arrived, followed closely by an ambulance and a fire truck. The entire intersection became a maze of flashing lights and official vehicles, drawing curious onlookers from the surrounding houses and businesses. Officer Janet Martinez was the first to approach, her hand resting casually on her service weapon as she took in the scene. Razor knew her by reputation, a 15-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department who'd grown up in the city's rougher neighborhoods and had little patience for troublemakers of any kind. "Sir, I need you to step away from the child," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Razor raised his hands slowly, making sure his movements were deliberate and non-threatening. "Officer Martinez, I'm Razor McKenzie from the animal shelter. This boy was in the crosswalk when that truck started rolling backward. I just got him out of the way." Martinez's expression didn't change, but Razor caught the moment when her eyes registered the tattoos on his forearms. The skull, the wings, the unmistakable 81 that marked him as a former member of the Hells Angels. Her stance shifted slightly, weight moving to the balls of her feet in preparation for trouble. "I need to see some identification," she said. "It's in my back pocket. May I reach for it?" Slowly, as Razor extracted his wallet with exaggerated care, Officer Martinez called for backup. Within minutes, 2 more cruisers arrived, and suddenly the intersection looked like the scene of a major crime rather than a prevented accident. The truck driver, who had finally realized what had happened, was explaining the situation to Officer Rodriguez, but the focus remained on Razor. "Marcus David McKenzie," Martinez read from his license. "You're on parole." "Yes, ma'am. 7 years served, 3 years supervised release. I check in with my officer every month, just like I'm supposed to. And these," she gestured to his tattoos, "former affiliation. I've been out of that life for 10 years. The boy's mother arrived then, having been called by a neighbor who'd witnessed the near accident. Jennifer Walsh was a single mom who worked as a nurse at Cedar Falls General, and seeing her 7-year-old son surrounded by police officers triggered every protective instinct she possessed. "Tommy!" She rushed to her son, gathering him into her arms before turning to face the assembled officers. "What happened? Is he hurt?" "Mom, your son is fine," Officer Rodriguez explained. There was a close call with a runaway truck, but this gentleman got him out of harm's way. Jennifer looked at Razor for the first time, taking in the tattoos, the leather jacket, the general aura of controlled violence that seemed to follow him despite his best efforts to project harmlessness. But Tommy was tugging at her sleeve, trying to get her attention. "Mom, he saved me," the boy said earnestly. "The big truck was coming and he picked me up and ran really fast. He got all my papers too." Before Jennifer could respond, a new voice cut through the commotion. "Is everyone getting this?" Razor turned to see a young woman with a smartphone held high, recording video of the scene. Behind her, several other onlookers had their phones out as well, documenting what looked like a confrontation between multiple police officers and a man whose appearance suggested he might be dangerous. "This is going straight to social media," the woman announced to no one in particular. "Cops hassling a hero. This is exactly the kind of thing people need to see." Officer Martinez stepped closer to Razor, lowering her voice. "Mr. McKenzie, I'm going to need you to come with us. There are questions we need to ask, and it would be better to do this at the station. Am I under arrest? Not at this time, but given your background and the circumstances are that he saved my son's life." Everyone turned to look at Jennifer Walsh, who was now standing with one protective arm around Tommy, while the other hand pointed directly at Razor. "I don't care what his tattoos say, or what he might have done 20 years ago," she continued, her nurse's training helping her project calm authority, even as her voice shook with emotion. "What I care about is that when my child was in danger, this man didn't hesitate to help. If you want to arrest someone, arrest the truck driver who wasn't paying attention to where his vehicle was rolling." But the crowd was growing, drawn by the flashing lights and the drama of the confrontation. More phones appeared, recording every angle of the scene. Razor could hear fragments of commentary from the onlookers, some supportive, others suspicious. The woman who'd first started filming was now providing live narration for her video. "So we have what appears to be a former gang member who just saved a kid's life, and instead of thanking him, the police are treating him like a criminal. How does that make sense?" That's when Daisy made her move. The golden retriever had been sitting patiently on the sidewalk where Razor had dropped her leash, watching the unfolding drama with the kind of intelligent attention that suggested she understood more than anyone gave her credit for. But as Officer Martinez moved to place handcuffs on Razor, just a precaution, you understand. Daisy rose to her feet and walked deliberately into the space between them. She didn't bark or growl or show any signs of aggression. She simply positioned herself so that anyone wanting to reach Razor would have to go through her first, then sat down and looked up at the assembled officers with liquid brown eyes that seemed to ask a simple question: "Really?" The effect was immediate and profound. Here was a dog, clearly well-trained, obviously well cared for, radiating the kind of calm confidence that only came from a life filled with love and security, placing herself between her person and what she perceived as a threat. It was a gesture so pure, so uncomplicated by the prejudices and assumptions that had shaped everyone else's reactions, that it stopped the entire confrontation in its tracks. "That's his dog?" Officer Martinez asked, though it was obviously a rhetorical question. "Her name is Daisy," Tommy Walsh piped up, breaking free from his mother's protective embrace to approach the golden retriever. "Can I pet her?" "Tommy, get back here," Jennifer started to say, but Razor nodded. "She's very gentle," he said. "She loves kids." As Tommy knelt beside Daisy, running small hands through her golden coat, the smartphones captured a different kind of image than what they'd been recording moments before. Here was a child who'd just been saved from serious injury, finding comfort with the dog belonging to the man who'd rescued him. Here was a moment of pure, uncomplicated connection that had nothing to do with tattoos or past mistakes or the prejudices that shaped adult interactions. "Ma'am?" Officer Martinez said to Jennifer, "We still need to file a report about the incident. Would you be willing to give a statement about what you witnessed?" Absolutely. And I want it on record that Mr. McKenzie acted heroically. Without his quick thinking, we might be dealing with a very different situation right now. The crowd began to disperse as the immediate drama faded, but the phones kept recording. Within hours, multiple videos of the incident would be uploaded to various social media platforms. Some would focus on the near accident and Razor's rescue of the boy. Others would highlight the tense confrontation with police and Daisy's intervention. All of them would spark discussions about redemption, prejudice, and the complicated nature of heroism in an age when everyone's past was just a Google search away. As the official vehicles finally departed and the intersection returned to something resembling normal, Razor found himself alone with Daisy and the 3 other dogs who'd waited patiently through the entire ordeal. The morning walk would need to be cut short. There was paperwork to fill out, statements to give, and explanations to provide to Sarah about why her volunteer had become the center of a police incident. But as he gathered the leashes and prepared to head back to the shelter, Razor couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just changed. For 3 years, he'd worked hard to maintain a low profile, to prove through quiet actions that he was no longer the man he'd once been. Now, thanks to the viral nature of modern communication, his story was about to be told by strangers who knew nothing about his journey from violence to redemption. The only question was whether the world would see a hero who'd saved a child's life, or a dangerous criminal who'd simply been in the right place at the right time. By noon, the first video had been shared over 3,000 times. Sarah Chen found Razor in the shelter's supply room, methodically organizing bags of dog food that were already perfectly organized. It was what he did when his mind was churning, found physical tasks that required just enough attention to keep his hands busy while his thoughts worked through whatever problem was eating at him. "We need to talk," she said, holding up her phone. On the screen was a grainy video titled, "Biker Saves Kid, Cops Treat Him Like Criminal." Razor didn't look up from the 40-pound bags of kibble he was restacking. "How bad is it? Depends on your perspective. The shelter's phone has been ringing non-stop. Half the callers want to adopt dogs from the place that employs heroes. The other half think we should fire you before you corrupt the animals." She sat down on a stack of blankets, studying his profile as he continued his unnecessary reorganization. In the 3 years since she'd hired him, Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of Razor's emotional state, the precise way he lined up corners when he was anxious, the careful modulation of his voice when he was fighting to stay calm, the way he avoided eye contact when he was wrestling with shame about his past. "The board meeting is tonight," she continued. "It was supposed to be about the Henderson complaint, but now it's about whether keeping me on staff is worth the headache." Razor finally looked at her, his weathered face resigned. "I can clean out my locker if it makes things easier." "Don't be ridiculous. You saved a child's life this morning. If the board has a problem with that, we'll find a different board." But even as she said it, Sarah knew the situation was more complicated than her defiant words suggested. The Cedar Falls animal shelter operated on a shoestring budget, dependent on donations, grants, and the goodwill of a community that was generally supportive but easily spooked. The viral nature of the morning's incident meant that their quiet, local charity work was about to be examined by strangers with their own agendas and assumptions. "There's something else," Razor said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a crumpled envelope, yellowed with age and soft from years of handling. Sarah could see that it had been opened and resealed multiple times, as if someone couldn't decide whether to read its contents or throw it away. "This came for me 6 months into my prison sentence, 20 years ago." His voice was barely above a whisper. "From my daughter." Sarah took the letter carefully, noting the childish handwriting that spelled out Marcus McKenzie in careful block letters. The return address was in Bakersfield, California. "Emma McKenzie, age 12. You never opened it?" "I opened it, read it, sealed it back up, Opened it again 6 months later, then again the year after that. Been carrying it ever since, reading it whenever I need to remember why I can't go back to the way things were. He was quiet for a long moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the shelter around them. Dogs barking in the distance, volunteers talking to potential adopters, the steady hum of the ventilation system that kept the air fresh despite housing. Nearly 40 animals. She was 12 when she wrote it. 12 years old, trying to understand why her daddy chose his motorcycle club over her. She told me about her school play, about learning to ride a bike, about how she still set a place for me at dinner every Sunday, even though Mom kept telling her I wasn't coming home. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she imagined the scene. A young girl processing her father's incarceration through the lens of a child's logic, trying to maintain connection with someone who'd effectively vanished from her life. She said she forgave me, Razor continued. Said she knew I must have had good reasons for the things I did because her daddy wasn't a bad man. She was so sure I'd write back, so certain that her letter would somehow fix everything between us. But you never did. How could I? What was I supposed to tell her? That Daddy was in prison because he'd beaten a man nearly to death for disrespecting the club. That the good reasons she was so sure I had were really just pride and violence, and a twisted sense of loyalty to people who'd sold me out the minute it was convenient. He took the letter back, handling it with the care most people reserved for fragile antiques. I told myself I was protecting her by staying away. Let her build a life without me, without the weight of what I'd done dragging her down. Better for her to think I was just gone than to know the truth about who her father really was. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both look up. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the shelter's volunteer veterinarian, appeared in the doorway with a concerned expression. Sarah, there are reporters outside. 3 news vans and what looks like a whole crowd of people with signs. Some of them seem friendly, but others. She trailed off, shaking her head. Through the supply room's small window, they could see the gathering crowd. Hand-lettered signs reading, "Heroes come in all forms," competed with others declaring, "Criminals don't deserve second chances." A local news crew was setting up for what appeared to be a live broadcast, while a group of motorcycle enthusiasts had gathered near the fence, their leather jackets and patches drawing nervous glances from other supporters. "This is my fault," Razor said, moving toward the door. "I should talk to them, explain." "You'll do nothing of the kind." Sarah's voice carried the authority that had built this shelter from nothing. "The last thing we need is you facing hostile questions without legal advice. Emily, can you handle the medical checks on the new arrivals? I need to call our lawyer." As Dr. Rodriguez headed back toward the clinic area, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for Cedar Falls City Hall. "Sarah Chen, Ms. Chen. This is Mayor Wilson's office. The mayor would like to schedule a meeting with you regarding the incident this morning and its impact on city operations." Sarah met Razor's eyes, seeing her own concern reflected there. Politicians didn't call for friendly chats when viral videos started making their city look bad. Of course. When would be convenient for the mayor? This afternoon, if possible. There are concerns about public safety and the city's liability if the situation escalates. After confirming a time for the meeting, Sarah ended the call and immediately dialed another number. "Tom Hendricks, please. This is Sarah Chen from the animal shelter. We have a situation that requires legal advice." While Sarah navigated the growing crisis, Razor found himself drawn back to the kennels, where the morning's routine continued despite the chaos outside. The dogs didn't care about viral videos or public relations disasters. They were concerned with more fundamental needs: food, attention, the simple comfort of human presence. Daisy trotted beside him as he moved from cage to cage, offering treats and reassurance to animals who could sense the tension in the air, even if they didn't understand its source. Chester pressed against the kennel door, seeking the physical contact that helped calm his anxiety. Luna whined softly, her shepherd instincts telling her that her pack was under threat. "I know, girl," Razor murmured, reaching through the chain link to scratch behind her ears. "Everything's upside down today, but we'll figure it out." As if summoned by his words, a volunteer named Margaret approached with a nervous expression. She was one of the shelter's longest-serving helpers, a retired teacher who'd been coming in twice a week for 5 years. "Razor, there's someone here to see you. She says she's from Channel 7 News, wants to do an interview about this morning." Through the window he could see a perfectly groomed reporter standing near the shelter's front entrance, microphone in hand, as her cameraman framed the shot. Behind her, the crowd had grown larger, with more signs and what looked like a counter-protest forming near the parking lot. "Tell her I'm not available for comment," Razor said. She seemed pretty insistent. Said the story was going to run with or without your input, and it would be better for everyone if you had a chance to tell your side. It was the classic media manipulation. Create a sense of urgency, suggest that silence would be interpreted as guilt or indifference. Razor had seen enough news coverage during his years with the Angels to know how these things worked. The story was already written in the reporter's mind. The interview was just an opportunity to get footage that supported whatever narrative they'd decided to pursue. "My side is that I saw a child in danger and helped him. Everything else is nobody's business." But even as he said it, Razor knew it wasn't that simple. The moment someone had pointed a camera at the scene this morning, his private journey toward redemption had become public property. People who knew nothing about his struggles, his growth, or his genuine desire to make amends for past mistakes would now feel entitled to judge him based on 30 seconds of viral video. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Saw the video. Know who you are. Some of us remember what you used to be capable of. Welcome home, brother." Razor deleted the message immediately, but the damage was done. His past wasn't just catching up with him, it was threatening to drag down everyone who'd taken a chance on him. Sarah, who'd risked her shelter's reputation to give him work. The volunteers who'd learned to see past his tattoos to the gentle man beneath. Even the animals, who depended on this place for their second chances at life. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd outside showed no signs of dispersing, Razor made a decision that felt both inevitable and heartbreaking. He pulled the 20-year-old letter from his pocket one more time, reading his daughter's words about forgiveness and faith and the unshakable belief that her daddy was fundamentally good. Maybe it was time to find out if Emma McKenzie still believed in second chances. 300 miles south in Bakersfield, Dr. Emma McKenzie was finishing her lunch when her phone started buzzing with notifications from colleagues, friends, and people she hadn't heard from in years. The messages all contained variations of the same thing. Links to a viral video, accompanied by questions like, "Is this your dad?" and "Did you see this?" At 32, Emma had built a successful veterinary practice specializing in animal behavioral therapy. Her clients included working dogs with PTSD, rescue animals with severe trust issues, and pets whose trauma manifested in ways that traditional veterinary medicine couldn't address. She'd found her calling in healing the psychological wounds that abuse and abandonment left behind, work that required infinite patience and an unshakable belief that even the most damaged creatures could learn to trust again. She watched the video 3 times before her hands stopped shaking enough to set the phone down. There he was, older, grayer, carrying himself with the careful control she remembered from her childhood, but unmistakably her father. The tattoos were still there, faded now, but still telling their story of a life lived on the margins. But there was something else. Something in the way he'd moved to protect that child, in the gentle hands that had scooped up scattered papers, in the way he'd spoken to the boy with such careful tenderness. And then there was the dog. Emma rewound the video to watch the golden retriever again, studying the animal's body language with her professional eye. The dog showed no signs of fear or stress despite the chaos around her. Her positioning between her owner and the police officers was deliberate but calm, protective, without being aggressive. This was an animal who trusted completely, who'd been treated with consistent kindness and respect. Dogs didn't lie about how they'd been treated. Their behavior told the truth that humans often tried to hide. Dr. McKenzie, her receptionist Linda, appeared in the doorway of the break room. "Your 2 o'clock appointment is here. Rex and his family." Emma pocketed her phone, pushing thoughts of her father aside. Rex was a German shepherd who'd been returned to 3 different families because of aggressive behavior that stemmed from his time as a military working dog in Afghanistan. Emma had been working with him for 6 months, slowly helping him understand that he was safe now, that the hypervigilance that had kept him alive in a war zone was no longer necessary. The therapy session required her full attention, guiding Rex through exercises designed to reduce his anxiety while teaching his new family how to read his signals and respond appropriately. But even as she worked, part of her mind kept returning to the video, to the man who'd raised her for the first 12 years of her life before everything fell apart. She remembered the good times, riding on the back of his Harley with a custom helmet he'd had made just for her, learning to throw a curveball in the backyard while he caught her pitches with exaggerated praise for every strike. He'd been the one who'd bandaged her scraped knees, who'd read her bedtime stories with voices for every character, who'd taught her that being strong didn't mean being mean. But she also remembered the night everything changed. The phone call. At 2 in the morning, her mother's tears, the news reports that used words like assault and felony charges and known associate of organized crime. The way their neighbors had looked at them afterward, the whispers at school, the slow realization that her father wasn't coming home. By the time her last appointment of the day was finished, Emma's phone showed 43 missed calls and over 200 text messages. The video had been picked up by major news outlets, and the story was spreading across social media platforms with the viral intensity that turned ordinary people into temporary celebrities. She drove home to her small house on the outskirts of Bakersfield, where her 2 rescue dogs, a pit bull named Duke and a border collie called Sage, greeted her with their usual enthusiasm. As she fed them and settled into her evening routine, Emma found herself pulled back to a box in her bedroom closet that she hadn't opened in years. The box contained the artifacts of her relationship with her father. Photographs from before. Everything went wrong. Cards he'd given her for birthdays and Christmas, and at the bottom, carefully preserved between sheets of tissue paper, a drawing she'd made when she was 8 years old. The crayon artwork showed 2 stick figures, one large and one small, standing beside a house with a motorcycle parked in front. At the top, in her careful child's handwriting, she'd written, "Me and Daddy." She'd drawn hearts floating around them like cartoon bubbles, and at the bottom the words, "Best Dad Ever" in red crayon. Looking at it now, Emma could remember exactly what she'd been thinking when she drew it. It was after one of his long absences, a club business trip that had lasted 2 weeks and left her mother worried and angry. But when he'd come home, he'd spent the entire next day with Emma, taking her to the zoo and letting her choose their dinner, and listening with complete attention as she told him everything that had happened while he was gone. She'd drawn the picture to capture that feeling, the absolute security of being his daughter, the certainty that no matter what else was happening in the complicated adult world, her father would always come home to her. The irony wasn't lost on her now. She'd become a veterinarian who specialized in healing traumatized animals, and her father, if the video was to be believed, had somehow found his way to similar work. They'd both ended up dedicating their lives to creatures that other people had given up on, finding purpose in the slow, patient process of rebuilding trust. Her phone rang, interrupting her reflection. The caller ID showed her best friend Rachel's number. Please tell me you've seen the video." "I've seen it. And? Are you okay? I mean, that's really him, right? Your dad?" Emma closed her eyes, seeing again the way her father had moved too. Save that child. The careful way he'd spoken to the boy, the golden retriever who'd positioned herself between him and danger with such quiet confidence. Yeah, that's really him. What are you going to do? It was the question Emma had been avoiding all afternoon. For 20 years, she'd convinced herself that her father had chosen his life with the Hell's Angels over his family. The letter she'd written as a 12-year-old had gone unanswered, confirming what her mother had told her, that Marcus McKenzie was too selfish, too committed to his criminal lifestyle to care about the daughter he'd left behind. But watching him this morning, seeing the man who'd risked his own safety without hesitation to protect a stranger's child, Emma found herself questioning everything she'd believed about his silence. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to drive up there tonight and demand to know why he never wrote back. Part of me wants to pretend I never saw the video and go on with my life. And the other part?" Emma looked down at the childhood drawing in her hands, at the simple faith captured in crayon and construction paper. The other part remembers what it felt like to be his daughter before everything went wrong, and wonders if maybe, after all this time, we both deserve to know what that could feel like again. After ending the call with Rachel, Emma sat in her quiet house and made the decision that would change both their lives. She opened her laptop and began researching Cedar Falls Animal Shelter, looking for contact information, directions, anything that might help her understand what her father's life had become in the 20 years since she'd last seen him. The shelter's website was simple but professional, featuring photos of successful adoptions and testimonials from grateful families. In several of the pictures, she could see him in the background, always slightly out of focus, clearly trying to avoid being the center of attention, but unmistakably present in the lives of these rescued animals. One photo in particular caught her attention. It showed a golden retriever, clearly the same dog from the viral video, sitting beside a little girl who was reading to her from a picture book. The caption identified it as part of the shelter's literacy program, where children practiced reading aloud to therapy animals. And there, kneeling beside the child with infinite patience, was her father. Emma stared at the image for a long time, trying to reconcile this gentle man with the dangerous figure she'd constructed in her memory. Then she picked up her phone and began dialing the number for Cedar Falls Animal Shelter, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope that felt exactly like coming home. The phone call came at 7:30 the next morning, just as Razor was preparing to leave for the shelter. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the timing made him answer, despite his usual policy of letting unknown callers go to voicemail. Marcus McKenzie. The voice was professional, female, with a slight California accent that triggered memories he'd spent 20 years trying to bury. "This is Razor." A pause, then softer. "It's Emma." The words hit him like a physical blow. Razor sank onto his couch, Daisy immediately sensing his distress and moving to press her warm body against his legs. 20 years of imagined conversations, of rehearsed explanations and apologies, of wondering what his daughter's voice would sound like as an adult woman. None of it had prepared him for this moment. "I saw the video," she continued when he couldn't find words. "Is that really you, working with animals?" "Yes." His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Emma, I need to understand something. The letter I wrote you in prison. Did you ever get it?" Razor closed his eyes, his free hand moving instinctively to the jacket pocket where he still carried that 20-year-old envelope. "I got it, and you chose not to answer." It wasn't a question, and the flat tone of her voice suggested she'd already drawn her conclusions about what his silence meant. But there was something else there too, a tremor that suggested the 12-year-old girl who'd written that letter was still somewhere inside the 32-year-old veterinarian, still waiting for her father to explain why he'd disappeared from her life. "It wasn't that simple," Razor said. "Then explain it to me. Because I've spent 20 years trying to understand what I did wrong, why my own father couldn't be bothered to write back to his daughter." The pain in her voice cut deeper than any knife he'd ever faced. This was what he'd been trying to protect her from, the knowledge that her father was exactly the kind of man who destroyed everything he touched. But she was calling him now, asking for truth instead of protection. And maybe she deserved that much after waiting 2 decades for an answer. You didn't do anything wrong. You were perfect, Em. You were the best thing I ever did with my life, and that's exactly why I couldn't write back. That makes no sense. I was in prison because I nearly killed a man, beat him so badly they weren't sure he'd walk again. And it wasn't self-defense or protection or any of the noble reasons you wanted to believe. I did it because he disrespected the club, because my pride was worth more to me than his life. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 20 years of missed birthdays, graduations, holidays, and all the small moments that make up a life. The letter you wrote, Razor continued, it was full of forgiveness and faith, and this beautiful belief that your daddy was fundamentally good. But I wasn't good, Em. I was a criminal who'd chosen violence over everything else, including my own family. How could I write back and destroy that faith? How could I tell a 12-year-old girl that her father was exactly the monster everyone said he was? So you let me think you just didn't care. I thought it would be easier for you to hate me than to know the truth about what I'd done. Emma was quiet for so long that Razor wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but distant. I became a veterinarian because of you. What? The animals. Do you remember bringing home strays when I was little? There was that 3-legged cat you found behind the garage, and the bird with the broken wing. You always said that just because something was hurt didn't mean it couldn't be helped. Razor did remember. Charlie, the orange tabby who'd lived with them for 6 years after losing his leg to a car. Pepper the crow who'd stayed for 3 weeks while his wing healed before flying away one morning without looking back. A dozen other creatures over the years, each one proof of his daughter's early understanding that vulnerability didn't diminish worth. I specialized in trauma therapy because I kept thinking about what you'd taught me, that healing takes time, that trust has to be rebuilt slowly, that love can overcome almost anything if you're patient enough. Her voice caught slightly. I've been helping broken animals learn to trust again for 10 years, and the whole time I've been carrying around my own broken trust in my father. The irony was devastating. While Emma had been building a career around the principles he'd taught her as a child, Razor had been applying those same principles to his own healing process, learning through daily acts of care and consistency that redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the work. The golden retriever in the video, Emma said. What's her name? Daisy. She's beautiful. And the way she moved to protect you, that's not trained behavior. That's love. She's special, Razor agreed, running his hand through Daisy's coat as the dog leaned into his touch. Found her at a kill shelter in Sacramento 3 years ago. Someone had dumped her there after her owner died, and she was scheduled to be put down the next day. The moment I saw her, I knew she was meant to be with me. Animals know, Emma said, and Razor could hear the veterinarian in her voice, the professional who'd spent years studying the intricate ways that trust and healing intersected. They don't care about your past or your mistakes. They respond to who you are in the present moment. It was exactly what Sarah had told him when she'd first hired him, exactly what he'd discovered during 3 years of patient work with traumatized animals. But hearing it from his daughter, understanding that she'd built her career around the same truth, created a connection that felt both profound and heartbreaking. I need to ask you something, Emma said, and I need you to be honest with me. Okay, if I drove up there to Cedar Falls, would you see me? Or would you disappear again because you think it's better for me not to know who you've become? The question hung in the air between them, carrying 20 years of hurt and hope and the possibility of something neither of them had dared to imagine. Razor thought about the board meeting that was scheduled for that evening, about the reporters camping outside the shelter, about all the ways his presence in Emma's life could complicate the successful career she'd built. But he also thought About the letter he'd carried for 2 decades, about the 12-year-old girl who'd believed so completely in her father's goodness that she'd forgiven him before he'd even asked. And he thought about the man he'd become through 3 years of daily choices to be better, to serve something larger than his own damaged past. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much. I'll drive up this weekend if that's okay." More than okay. After they'd exchanged basic information, addresses, phone numbers, the kind of practical details that felt surreal after decades of silence, Emma's voice grew softer. Marcus. He hadn't heard his real name spoken with love in 20 years. The sound of it nearly broke him. "Yeah? The man I saw in that video, protecting a child, working with animals, living quietly and doing good. That's who I always hoped you'd become. I'm proud of you." Long after she'd hung up, Razor sat on his couch, with Daisy pressed against his side, staring at his phone as if it might offer some explanation for the grace he'd just received. Forgiveness wasn't something he'd expected or felt he deserved. But Emma had offered it freely, along with something even more precious, the chance to be her father again. Outside, he could hear the murmur of voices as reporters and protesters continued their vigil near the shelter. The viral video had made him a symbol in a cultural debate he'd never asked to join, but it had also accomplished something he'd thought impossible. It had brought his daughter back into his life. The weekend couldn't come fast enough. The board, meeting that evening, drew a larger crowd than anyone had expected. The Cedar Falls Animal Shelter's conference room, normally adequate for the 5 board members and occasional guest, now overflowed with concerned citizens, reporters, and animal welfare advocates who'd driven in from neighboring counties. Sarah had tried to limit attendance to official business, but the viral nature of the morning's incident had made that impossible. Razor sat in the back corner with Daisy at his feet, watching the proceedings with the calm detachment he'd learned during 7 years of prison hearings. Board Chairwoman Margaret Winters called the meeting to order, her voice struggling to carry over the murmur of 30-plus attendees packed into a space designed for 10. "While we appreciate the community's interest in the shelter's operations," Winters began, "this is a closed board meeting to address personnel matters. We ask that observers please limit their comments to the public comment period." But before she could continue, Mrs. Henderson rose from her seat in the front row, her perfectly styled grey hair and designer jacket marking her as someone accustomed to being heard. "Margaret, I think we all know why we're here. This morning's incident has brought national attention to our community, and not the kind of attention we want. I've received calls from parents who are now afraid to let their children walk to school because they might encounter this individual." She gestured toward Razor without looking at him directly, as if eye contact might somehow contaminate her. "I understand that Mr. McKenzie may have prevented an accident today, but that doesn't erase his documented history of violence. How can we, in good conscience, continue to employ someone whose very presence makes families feel unsafe?" A rumble of agreement rose from several attendees, but it was quickly countered by voices of support. Pastor David Martinez stood up, his clerical collar visible beneath his casual jacket. "With respect, Mrs. Henderson, I've been volunteering at this shelter for 2 years, and I've never seen anyone show more patience and dedication than Razor. The man I know bears no resemblance to whatever criminal record you're referencing." "Character references don't change facts," Mrs. Henderson shot back. "The facts are that he was convicted of aggravated assault and served 7 years in state prison. The facts are that he was a documented member of a criminal organization. The facts are that our children deserve better than to have their safety dependent on the good behavior of convicted felons." Dr. Williams, the shelter's veterinary consultant, leaned forward in his chair. "Mrs. Henderson, the facts are also that our adoption rates have increased by 300% since Razor started working here. The facts are that he's helped rehabilitate animals that other shelters had given up on. The facts are that every single person who's worked with him will tell you he's transformed this place." The argument might have continued indefinitely if Tommy Walsh hadn't walked into the room, followed closely by his mother, Jennifer. The 7-year-old boy looked around at all the serious adult faces before focusing on Razor. "Hi, Mr. Razor," he said with the uncomplicated directness of childhood. "I brought you something." He approached Razor's chair and handed him a piece of construction paper covered in crayon drawings. The artwork showed a stick figure man with impressive tattoos standing next to a golden dog, with the words "My Hero" written across the top in careful block letters. "Tommy insisted on coming tonight," Jennifer explained to the room. "He wanted to thank the man who saved his life, and frankly, I think this community needs to hear from someone who actually experienced what happened this morning, instead of just reading about it on social media." She guided Tommy to the front of the room, where the boy looked out at the assembled adults with the fearless honesty that only children possessed. "The man with the pictures on his arms saved me from the truck," Tommy announced, "and his dog is really nice. She let me pet her, and she was soft, and she wasn't scared of anything. If Mr. Razor is a bad man, why does he have such a good dog?" The question hung in the air with devastating simplicity. Everyone in the room understood the logic that children and animals operated by, a logic uncomplicated by adult prejudices and assumptions. Dogs didn't bond with people who mistreated them. Children didn't instinctively trust adults who meant them harm. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed as she realized her position had just been undermined by a 7-year-old and a golden retriever. "That's very sweet, Tommy," she said with forced patience, "but children don't always understand complex situations." "I understand that Mr. Razor got hurt stopping the truck from hitting me," Tommy interrupted with the stubborn clarity that only came from personal experience. "And I understand that Daisy loves him, and dogs are really good at knowing who's nice and who's not." The meeting continued for another hour, with testimonials from volunteers, statistics about the shelter's success, and increasingly heated exchanges between supporters and detractors. But the real decision had been made the moment Tommy Walsh had called Razor his hero in front of a room full of adults who'd forgotten how to see past surface assumptions to recognize genuine goodness. When the vote was finally called, it was 4-1 in favor of retaining Razor's employment, with only Mrs. Henderson dissenting. The decision was accompanied by a unanimous resolution commending his actions in saving Tommy Walsh's life. As the crowd dispersed and the reporters rushed to file their stories, Razor found himself alone in the conference room with Sarah and Daisy. The golden retriever had slept through most of the proceedings, occasionally opening one eye to monitor the rising voices before deciding the situation was under control. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked. "Like I just won a battle I didn't." "No, I was fighting," Razor admitted, "but I'm not naive enough to think this is over. The video's still out there, getting shared and commented on by people who don't know anything about what really happened. Let them talk. The people who matter, the ones who've actually worked with you, who've seen what you do here every day, they know who you are." Razor nodded, but his mind was already on the weekend, on the daughter who'd somehow found the courage to reach across 20 years of silence and offer him something he'd never expected to receive. Emma was driving up from Bakersfield on Saturday, and he still had no idea what he was going to say to her when she arrived. The shelter felt different when he arrived the next morning. Word of the board meeting's outcome had spread through the volunteer community, and there was an energy in the air that hadn't been there before, a sense that they'd weathered a storm and emerged stronger. Dogs that had been anxious during the previous day's chaos seemed calmer, responding to the renewed confidence of their caretakers. But the real change was in how the community responded to Razor's presence. Where before he'd been tolerated as a necessary part of the shelter's operations, now people seemed to actively seek him out. Mrs. Patterson from 3 blocks over arrived with a batch of homemade dog treats and a thank you card signed by her entire book club. The Martinez family brought their teenage daughter to volunteer, specifically requesting that she work with Razor to learn proper animal handling techniques. Even the police response had shifted. When Officer Rodriguez stopped by to check on things, he sought out Reza personally to apologize for the previous day's confrontation. "We were just following protocol," Rodriguez explained. "Man, with your history in a situation like that, we had to treat it as potentially dangerous until we understood what had happened." "I get it," Reza replied, and he meant it. "You were protecting the community. That's your job. Still, the way things escalated, that wasn't necessary. Martinez feels bad about it too. She's been a cop long enough to know the difference between someone looking for trouble and someone trying to avoid it." As the week progressed, the shelter received donation checks from people across the country who'd been moved by the story. A pet food company called to offer a year's supply of premium dog food. 3 different animal rescue organizations reached out about collaboration opportunities. The attention was overwhelmingly positive, but Reza found himself increasingly uncomfortable with being the center of it all. "I didn't save that kid to become famous," he confided to Sarah as they walked the dogs on Friday afternoon. "I just did what anyone would have done." "Not anyone," Sarah corrected. "Most people would have hesitated, worried about getting involved, thought about liability or personal risk. You saw a child in danger and acted without thinking about consequences. That's not common, Reza. That's heroic." Saturday morning arrived, grey and drizzling, with the kind of persistent rain that made outdoor work miserable but provided a natural barrier against curious onlookers. Reza had barely slept, his mind cycling through decades of memories and imagined conversations with the daughter he hadn't seen since she was 12 years old. Emma had texted the night before to confirm she was driving up, estimating an arrival time of around 10 in the morning. She'd also sent a photo, a professional headshot from her veterinary clinic's website that showed a woman who'd inherited his dark hair and stubborn chin but had her mother's gentle eyes and warm smile. Looking at that photo, Reza could see traces of the little girl who'd drawn him pictures and insisted on helping him feed the stray cats that hung around their old house. But there was also something harder there, a strength that came from surviving disappointment and building a successful life despite the absence of the person who should have been there to support her. At 9:50, a blue Honda Civic pulled into the shelter's parking lot. Through the rain-streaked windows, Reza could see a woman with dark hair gathered in a practical ponytail, hands gripping the steering wheel as she stared at the building where her father worked. She sat there for several minutes, and Reza found himself holding his breath, wondering if she might lose her nerve and drive away without ever getting out of the car. But then the car door opened, and Emma McKenzie stepped into the rain, pulling up the hood of her jacket as she walked toward the entrance of the Cedar Falls animal shelter with the determined stride of someone who'd driven 300 miles to finally get answers to questions that had been eating at her for 20 years. The shelter's front door chimed as Emma stepped inside, shaking rain from her jacket while her eyes adjusted to the fluorescent lighting. The space was larger than she'd expected, with the reception area decorated with photos of successful adoptions and a bulletin board covered in thank you cards from grateful families. The sound of barking drifted from somewhere deeper in the building, along with the familiar scents of disinfectant pet food and the indefinable smell of animals living in close quarters. "Can I help you?" A young volunteer approached with a friendly smile, clearly unaware of the significance of this particular visitor. "I'm looking for Marcus McKenzie, Reza." Before the volunteer could respond, Sarah Chen emerged from her office, drawn by something in Emma's voice that suggested this wasn't a routine inquiry. "You must be Emma," Sarah said, extending her hand. "Your father's told me so much about you over the years." Emma found herself studying this woman who'd given her father work when no one else would, trying to understand what kind of person took that kind of risk. Sarah was younger than she'd expected, with an air of competent authority that suggested she was accustomed to making difficult decisions and living with their consequences. "He's in the back with the dogs," Sarah continued. "Would you like me to get him? Actually, I'd like to see what he does here first, if that's okay." Sarah nodded, understanding instinctively that Emma needed to observe before engaging, to see her father in his element before facing the emotional weight of their reunion. They walked through the shelter's main corridor, past kennels filled with dogs of every size and description. Emma's professional eye automatically catalogued their conditions: clean spaces, fresh water, toys and blankets for comfort. This wasn't a warehouse operation focused solely on housing unwanted animals. This was a place where individual needs were considered, where rehabilitation was as important as simple care. He started as a volunteer, Sarah explained as they walked, 3 days a week, just helping with dog walks and basic maintenance. But within a month, it was clear he had a gift for working with the difficult cases. They paused outside a kennel, where a large pit bull mix was lying quietly on a raised bed, his massive head resting on crossed paws. A sign on the kennel door identified him as Chester and noted that he was working on trust issues and making excellent progress. Chester came to us with a chain embedded in his neck, Sarah continued. He'd been used as a bait dog for fighting, then abandoned when he was too damaged to be useful. He was so traumatized he couldn't let anyone within 6 feet of him. The first time Razor sat outside his kennel and just talked to him for an hour, I thought it was hopeless. But your father has infinite patience when it comes to healing. They found Razor in the shelter's largest play area, sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor, while 3 dogs explored around him with varying degrees of confidence. Romeo was pressed against his side, accepting belly rubs with blissful abandon. Faith, the nervous border collie, was slowly approaching from across the room, drawn by his calm presence, but still ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. And Daisy lay beside him like a golden guardian, monitoring the other dogs while keeping one eye on her person. Emma stood in the doorway, watching her father work. His movements were slow and deliberate, designed to communicate safety to animals whose trust had been broken by previous humans. When Faith finally worked up the courage to sniff his extended hand, he remained perfectly still, letting her set the pace of their interaction. "That's a brave girl," he murmured to the border collie. "You're learning that not everyone is going to hurt you." The words hit Emma like a physical blow because she could hear the parallel meaning beneath them. This was a man who understood trauma from both sides, as someone who'd inflicted it and someone who'd learned to heal from it. "Dad," Razor looked up, and for a moment, the years fell away. Emma saw the man who'd taught her to throw a curveball, who'd read her bedtime stories with different voices for every character, who'd made her feel like the most important person in his world. But she also saw the weight of 20 years in. The lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, the immediate concern that flickered across his features. He started to rise, but Emma was already moving toward him, crossing the space between them with quick steps that were half walk, half run. The embrace that followed was 20 years in the making, awkward at first as 2 adults who'd last touched when one was a child tried to navigate the physical reality of reunion. But then Emma's arms tightened around her father's shoulders, and Razor's careful control finally cracked. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "God, Em, I'm so sorry." "I know," she whispered back. "I know you are." They held each other for a long moment while the dogs watched with the patient attention that animals gave to important human rituals. Daisy's tail thumped softly against the concrete, as if she approved of this development. Faith had retreated to her corner but remained visible, curiosity overcoming caution as she observed this new dynamic in her safe space. When they finally separated, Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, laughing at herself for crying. In front of a man she'd spent 2 decades learning to live without. "You look different," she said, studying his face. "Older, obviously, but peaceful. I remember you always being so tense, like you were waiting for something bad to happen." "I was. When you're living the way I was living, something bad is always about to happen. It's just a matter of when and how much damage it'll do when it gets there." Emma knelt beside Daisy, running her hands through the golden coat with the practiced touch of someone who understood animal behavior. The dog accepted her attention immediately, recognizing a kindred spirit. "She's beautiful. How long have you had her?" 3 years. Found her at a kill shelter in Sacramento. She was scheduled to be euthanized the next day because her owner had. It died and no one wanted a 7-year-old dog. 7. She must have been 10 when you got her. Emma continued her examination, noting the slight graying around Daisy's muzzle that confirmed her age. "That's old for a rescue. Most people want puppies. Most people are missing out. The older ones have so much wisdom, so much love to give. They just need someone patient enough to earn their trust." Emma looked up at her father, hearing the layers of meaning in his words. "Is that what you learned here about patience and trust?" "I learned that healing is possible if you're willing to do the work every single day. That consistency matters more than grand gestures. That love isn't something you feel. It's something you do, over and over, until it becomes who you are, instead of who you used to be." They talked for 2 hours in that concrete room, surrounded by rescued animals who provided a living testament to the possibility of redemption. Emma told him about her veterinary practice, about the specialized training she'd pursued in animal behavioral therapy, about the satisfaction she found in helping traumatized creatures learn to trust again. "I think I understand now why you never wrote back," she said, as their conversation wound toward its natural conclusion. "You were protecting me from knowing who you thought you were. But Dad, I need you to understand something." She reached into her purse and withdrew a small plastic bag containing what looked like medical documents. "I've been looking for you for 8 years. Razor stared at the papers, confusion clear on his face. "What do you mean?" "After I graduated from veterinary school, I hired a private investigator. I wanted to know where you were, what had happened to you after prison. The search took 2 years because you'd changed your name from Marcus to Razor legally, and you'd moved around quite a bit after your release. The documents were copies of public records, parole paperwork, employment history, even a credit report that showed his modest financial situation. At the bottom of the stack was a hospital bracelet, small and faded, with Emma McKenzie, age 8, printed on the white plastic. "I kept this," she said, holding up the bracelet, "from when I broke my arm falling off the monkey bars. Do you remember what happened?" Razor's face went pale as the memories surfaced. Emma had been showing off for some older kids, attempting a dangerous traverse that was beyond her skill level. The fall had been bad, a compound fracture that required surgery and months of physical therapy. But what he remembered most was his own reaction to seeing his little girl in pain. "I found the kids who'd been teasing you into trying something dangerous," he said quietly. "Their fathers and I had a conversation about it. You put 2 grown men in the hospital. They were bullies who'd hurt my daughter by proxy. I wasn't going to let that slide." Emma nodded as if she'd expected this confirmation. "That's when Mum really started pushing for you to leave the club. She said she couldn't live with someone whose first instinct was always violence, even when he was trying to protect people he loved. She was right. I was dangerous, Em, not just to strangers, but to everyone around me, including you. But that's not who you became." Emma gestured around the shelter, to the dogs who'd accepted her presence without question, because they trusted her father's judgment. "The man I've been watching for the past 2 hours, the man who saved that little boy yesterday, he's exactly the father I always hoped you could be." She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo from her veterinary clinic's website. It featured Emma kneeling beside a German shepherd whose scarred muzzle suggested a difficult past, both of them smiling as the dog accepted her gentle examination. "This is Rex. He was a military working dog in Afghanistan, retired with severe PTSD that made him dangerous to be around. 3 families returned him before his handler contacted me. It took 18 months of careful work, but he's living happily now with a veteran who understands what he's been through." Razor studied the photo, seeing his daughter's professional competence, but also recognizing something deeper, the same patience and dedication he'd discovered in his work with traumatized animals. "I became a veterinarian because you taught me that broken things could be fixed," Emma continued. "And I specialized in behavioral therapy because I understood what it meant to love someone who was struggling with their own damage." The revelation hung between them, recontextualizing 20 years of separation and silence. While Razor had been learning to heal through service to abandoned animals, Emma had been building a career around the same principles, applying the lessons of patience and unconditional love that he taught her before everything went wrong. "There's something else," Emma said, and Razor heard the shift in her tone that suggested they were approaching the real reason for her visit. "The private investigator didn't just find your current address. He found records of every job you've held since your release, every place you've lived, every interaction with law enforcement." She pulled out a thick folder from her purse, filled with documents that chronicled his decade-long journey from ex-convict to respected community member. Construction work in Fresno for 18 months. Night security at a warehouse in Modesto for 2 years. Volunteer work at an animal rescue in Sacramento before you got the job here. "Dad, I've been following your progress for years, watching you rebuild your life one honest job at a time." Razor felt the ground shift beneath him as he processed what she was telling him. "You knew where I was? For 8 years. I drove up here twice, once 2 years ago, once last Christmas. Both times I sat in the parking lot for hours, trying to work up the courage to come inside." "Why didn't you?" Emma's smile was sad but understanding. "Because I could see through the windows how content you were. You'd found something that gave your life meaning, work that made you proud of who you'd become. And I was afraid that if I walked back into your life, I might somehow disrupt that peace you'd fought so hard to find." The irony was devastating and beautiful. For 8 years, they'd both been protecting each other from imagined pain while carrying the real pain of separation. Razor had stayed away to protect Emma from his damaged past, while Emma had stayed away to protect him from the complications her presence might bring. "The viral video changed everything," Emma continued. "Suddenly the whole world was watching you, judging you, making assumptions about who you are based on 30 seconds of footage. And I realized that if strangers were going to define your story, maybe it was time for your daughter to speak up about who you really are." They were interrupted by the sound of vehicles in the parking lot. Through the window, they could see news vans arriving, along with what appeared to be protesters from both sides of the morning's debate. Word had leaked about Emma's visit, and the media was eager to capture the next chapter of the story that had captured national attention. "They know you're here," Razor said, recognizing the feeding frenzy energy of journalists scenting a developing story. "Good," Emma replied, surprising him with the steel in her voice, "because it's time this community understood exactly what kind of man my father has become and what kind of daughter he raised." The phone call from Channel 7's producer came at 8 that evening, just as Razor and Emma were finishing dinner at a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. They'd spent the afternoon talking through 20 years of separation, filling in the gaps between the daughter's memories and the father's regrets, while Daisy provided emotional support from her position beneath their table. "Mr. McKenzie, this is Patricia Hendricks from Channel 7 News. We'd like to invite you and your daughter to appear on our weekly magazine show, Sunday Spotlight. It's a longer format than our regular news programming, which would give you time to tell your story properly." Razor looked across the table at Emma, who was listening to his side of the conversation with growing interest. She changed into casual clothes for dinner, jeans and a soft sweater that made her look younger, more like the girl he remembered. But her expression carried the focused attention of someone accustomed to making important decisions under pressure. "I appreciate the offer," Razor said into the phone, "but I'm not looking for publicity. I just want to get back to my work with the animals." "Mr. McKenzie, the story is going to be told whether you participate or not. Social media has made sure of that. The question is whether you want accurate information included or whether you'd prefer to let speculation and assumption drive the narrative. It was the same argument he'd heard from the reporter at the scene, but delivered with more sophistication. Emma reached across the table and gently took the phone from his hand. "This is Dr. Emma McKenzie," she said with professional confidence. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Dr. McKenzie, we're honored to speak with you. Sunday Spotlight airs live tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. It's a 30-minute format that would allow both you and your father to share your perspectives on his transformation and your reunion. Our host, Janet Morrison, is known for her thoughtful approach to complex human interest stories." Emma was quiet for a moment, considering. Razor watched her face, seeing the calculation happening behind her eyes, the weighing of risks and benefits that came from years of building a professional reputation that could be damaged by association. "What kind of questions would you be asking? About his journey from incarceration to community service, about your decision to reconnect after 20 years, about what this reunion means for both of you and for the broader conversation about redemption and second chances, and about his criminal past." That would certainly be part of the discussion, but in the context of transformation rather than sensationalism. Our viewers are interested in authentic stories about people who've overcome significant challenges. Emma looked at Razor, raising her eyebrows in a silent question. The decision was his to make, but she was clearly prepared to support whatever choice he made. "We need time to think about it," Razor said, taking the phone back. "Of course, but I should mention that we've received calls from other networks expressing interest in the story. If you decide to share your experience publicly, we'd love to be the venue for that conversation." After ending the call, they sat in comfortable silence while Emma processed what she'd just heard. The restaurant was nearly empty, with only a few other diners scattered among the wooden tables and dim lighting that made conversation feel private and intimate. "You don't have to do this," Razor said finally. "Your career, your reputation, associating with me publicly could hurt both of those things." "Actually, I think you're wrong about that." Emma pulled out her phone and showed him the screen. Her veterinary clinic's social media pages had been flooded with messages from people who'd seen the viral video and made the connection. "Look at these comments." Razor scrolled through dozens of messages from pet owners expressing support and admiration. Many mentioned that seeing his work with animals had given them hope for their own rescue pets. Others praised Emma's professional accomplishments and expressed interest in her behavioral therapy services. "People aren't stupid," Emma continued. "They can see the difference between someone who's genuinely changed and someone who's just pretending to be better. The video shows you working with animals who obviously trust you completely. That kind of trust doesn't develop overnight with someone who's still dangerous. But the interview is an opportunity to control our own narrative, instead of letting strangers define us. Dad, you saved a child's life. You've spent years rebuilding yourself through service to creatures that other people threw away. That's not a story to be ashamed of. That's a story that might help other people believe that change is possible." They spent the next hour discussing the potential appearance, working through the kinds of questions they might face and the key points they wanted to communicate. Emma's media training, gained through years of public speaking about animal welfare, proved invaluable as she helped Razor think through how to present his transformation in terms that would resonate with viewers who knew nothing about his journey. "The most important thing," she said, "is authenticity. Don't try to minimize your past or make excuses for choices you made. Own what you did, explain what you learned, and let people see who you've become. And if they ask about why I never contacted you, tell them the truth. That you thought you were protecting me by staying away, and that you didn't realize protection and abandonment could look exactly the same from the outside." Sunday morning arrived bright and clear with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. Razor and Emma met at the shelter early, both nervous about the evening's appearance, but finding comfort in the familiar routine of caring for animals who needed them. The production crew arrived at noon to set up for the live broadcast. Sunday. Spotlight had chosen to film on location rather than in a studio, recognizing that the shelter setting would provide important context for viewers trying to understand Razor's transformation. Camera operators worked around the kennels, capturing footage of the dogs and the volunteers who'd come in, despite it being their day off, to show support. Janet Morrison, the show's host, spent an hour with Razor and Emma before the broadcast, going over the interview format and helping them feel comfortable with the process. She was a veteran journalist in her early 50s, with the kind of warm professionalism that put nervous guests at ease, while still asking the hard questions her viewers expected. The story has clearly resonated with people, Morrison explained, as they sat in the shelter's main area, surrounded by the cameras and lighting equipment that would soon broadcast their conversation to thousands of viewers. But I think what makes it compelling isn't just the dramatic rescue. It's the questions it raises about redemption, about whether people can truly change, about what society owes to those who've paid their debt and are trying to rebuild. Those are big questions, Emma said. They are, but your father's story and your decision to reconnect with him offers a very personal perspective on those issues. Sometimes the most profound truths come from individual experience rather than abstract policy debates. As the technical preparations continued around them, Razor found himself thinking about the journey that had led to this moment. 7 years in prison, learning the hard way that violence only begot more violence. 3 years of parole, struggling to find work and housing while carrying the weight of his past choices. The day he'd walked into this shelter and Sarah had seen something in him worth investing in. The slow process of earning trust from animals and humans alike, building a new identity, one small act of service at a time. And now, sitting beside the daughter he'd thought he'd lost forever, preparing to share their story with strangers who would judge them based on a few minutes of television, Razor felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Hope for a future that included the possibility of true forgiveness. 5 minutes to air, the director announced, and suddenly the casual atmosphere of the afternoon shifted into the focused energy of live television. Emma reached over and squeezed her father's hand, offering the same kind of reassurance he'd once given her before school plays and piano recitals. "Remember," she said softly, "just tell the truth. The truth is beautiful enough on its own." Daisy positioned herself at Razor's feet, sensing the importance of the moment even if she didn't understand its details. Around them, the shelter hummed with its usual evening activity, dogs settling in for the night, volunteers finishing their tasks, the comfortable sounds of a place where healing happened quietly and consistently. In a few minutes, the cameras would be rolling and their story would become public property. But for now, in the last quiet moments before everything changed again, Razor McKenzie sat with his daughter and his dog in a place that had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that redemption wasn't a destination you reached, but a choice you made every single day to be better than you were the day before. Good evening and welcome to Sunday Spotlight. I'm Janet Morrison, and tonight we're broadcasting live from the Cedar Falls Animal Shelter, where earlier this week a viral video captured a moment that has sparked a national conversation about redemption, heroism, and second chances. The red light on the main camera glowed steadily as Morrison addressed the television audience, her voice carrying the warm authority that had made her one of the region's most trusted journalists. With me tonight are Marcus Razor McKenzie, a former member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club who served 7 years in prison for aggravated assault, and his daughter, Dr. Emma McKenzie, a veterinarian specializing in animal behavioral therapy. They're here to share their story of separation, transformation, and an unexpected reunion triggered by 30 seconds of viral video. Razor felt his mouth go dry as the reality of live television hit him. Somewhere out there, Thousands of people were watching, forming opinions about him based on his appearance, his tattoos, the careful way he held himself in the unfamiliar setting of a television interview. Beside him, Emma sat with professional composure, but he could see the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested she was as nervous as he was. "Razor, let's start with what happened Tuesday morning. Tell us about the incident that brought you to national attention." "I was walking dogs from the shelter, same route I take every morning. There was a child in the crosswalk, Tommy Walsh, and a delivery truck that was rolling backward down a hill. The driver couldn't see what was happening. I saw the boy was in danger, so I got him out of the way." That sounds very straightforward, but the video shows police officers responding to you as if you were a threat rather than a hero. Why do you think that happened? Razor glanced at his forearms, where the tattoos were clearly visible despite his long-sleeved shirt. "I understand their reaction. When you see someone with my history and my markings in a situation involving a child, you're going to assume the worst until you know otherwise. That's just good police work. But you weren't just someone with tattoos. You were someone who had just saved a child's life." The officers didn't know that initially. They saw what they saw and responded accordingly. "I don't hold that against them." Morrison turned to Emma, her expression shifting to convey the personal nature of what they were about to discuss. "Dr. McKenzie, you hadn't spoken to your father in 20 years before this week. What was it like to see him in that viral video?" Emma's hand moved unconsciously to her purse, where she still carried the childhood drawing of her and her father. Confusing, emotional, but also familiar. The man I saw protecting that child was the same man who used to protect me when I was young. The same gentle hands, the same instinct to put others' safety before his own. But he was also a convicted felon who'd been absent from your life since you were 12 years old. How do you reconcile those two realities? "By understanding that people are more complicated than their worst moments," Emma replied, her veterinarian's training helping her stay calm under pressure. "In my work, I see animals every day who've been traumatized, who've learned to respond to the world with fear or aggression because that's what kept them alive. But underneath that defensive behavior, there's usually a creature who's capable of love and trust if given the right environment to heal." "Are you comparing your father to a traumatized animal?" Emma smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd shown since the cameras started rolling. "I'm saying that healing is possible for anyone willing to do the work, and the evidence of my father's healing isn't in what he says about himself. It's in how the animals at this shelter respond to him." As if summoned by her words, Daisy rose from her position at Razor's feet and moved into the camera's field of view. The golden retriever settled beside his chair with the calm confidence of a dog who belonged exactly where she was. Her presence, adding a layer of authenticity that no amount of coaching could have provided. "This is Daisy," Morrison said, clearly pleased by the unscripted addition to their broadcast. "She's the dog who positioned herself between you and the police officers in Tuesday's confrontation. Tell us about your relationship with her." Razor's hand moved automatically to Daisy's head, his fingers finding the spot behind her ears that never failed to make her tail wag. "Daisy was scheduled to be euthanized when I found her 3 years ago. 10 years old, owner had died. No one wanted to adopt a senior dog. But the moment I saw her, I knew she had years of love left to give. She just needed someone patient enough to earn it. And now she's become something of a celebrity herself. The image of her protecting you has been shared millions of times across social media platforms. She was just doing what she's always done, looking out for her family. Dogs don't see tattoos or criminal records. They see how you treat them every single day, and they respond accordingly." Morrison leaned forward slightly, signaling a shift to more serious territory. "But not everyone has been as forgiving as Daisy. There's been significant pushback from community members who believe that certain crimes should disqualify someone from working with animals or in positions of public trust. How do you respond to those concerns?" Reza took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question and the thousands of viewers waiting for his response. This was the moment he'd been dreading and preparing for simultaneously, the point where he'd have to confront his past honestly while defending the man he'd become. "I understand those concerns because I share them," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotional turbulence beneath. "If someone had told me 20 years ago that I'd be working with vulnerable animals, I'd have said they were crazy. The man I was then shouldn't have been trusted with that responsibility. But you believe you should be trusted now. I believe I've earned the right to be judged by my actions over the past decade rather than my crimes from 20 years ago. Every morning for 3 years, I've shown up at this shelter before dawn to care for animals that nobody else wanted. I've never missed a day, never shown anger toward an animal or a volunteer, never done anything except try to give these creatures the second chance that someone gave me." Morrison's expression suggested she was building toward something, the kind of pointed questioning that separated good journalists from mere celebrities. "But your past wasn't just about poor choices or mistakes in judgment. According to court records, you were convicted of aggravated assault against Vincent Torres, a man you beat so severely he required reconstructive surgery and months of rehabilitation. That's not a youthful indiscretion. That's a deliberate act of violence that could have killed someone." The studio went silent, except for the quiet hum of camera equipment. Reza could feel the weight of Emma's attention, the cameras capturing every micro-expression, the viewers at home making judgments about his character based on how he responded to this moment of reckoning. "Vincent Torres disrespected my club by selling drugs in territory we considered ours," Reza said, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone reciting facts rather than making excuses. "The code I lived by then said that disrespect had to be answered with violence, that backing down made you weak. So I found him in a bar in Stockton and I beat him until he couldn't fight back. Do you regret that action?" "I regret everything about the man I was then. The violence, the pride, the twisted sense of loyalty that made me think hurting someone was a valid response to a business dispute. But most of all, I regret the cost that violence had on my family, on my daughter who lost her father because I chose the club over everything else that mattered." Emma reached over and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of support that the cameras captured and that would be replayed in news segments for weeks to come. "Dad," she said, addressing him directly for the first time since the interview began, "tell them about the letter." Morrison's journalistic instincts immediately engaged. "What letter?" Reza reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the 20-year-old envelope, handling it with the care of someone touching something sacred. 6 months into my prison sentence, I received a letter from Emma. She was 12 years old, trying to understand why her father had been taken away, but still believing that I was fundamentally good. She told me about her life, about school, and friends, and all the normal things that a 12-year-old girl cares about. And she told me she forgave me, but you never responded. How could I? She was asking me to be the father she remembered, the man she believed I was, underneath all the violence and criminality. But I wasn't that man anymore, and I didn't know if I could ever become him again. I thought it was kinder to let her build a life without me than to disappoint her by proving I was exactly the failure everyone said I was. Emma's voice was thick with emotion when she spoke. What he didn't understand was that his silence hurt more than any truth he could have told. Me. I spent 20 years thinking my father didn't love me enough to write back, when the reality was that he loved me too much to risk disappointing me again. The interview continued for another 10 minutes, with Morrison guiding them through the details of their reunion and the broader implications of Reza's transformation. But the real climax had already occurred, the moment when a man who'd spent decades hiding from his past chose to confront it honestly in front of a national audience, with his daughter beside him offering the kind of grace that made redemption possible, As the credits rolled and the cameras stopped recording, the shelter filled with the sound of applause from the volunteers and supporters who'd gathered to watch the broadcast. Phones began buzzing immediately with messages from viewers who'd been moved by their story, and the social media response was overwhelmingly positive. "That was beautiful," Morrison said as the production crew began packing their equipment. "Authentic. Stories like yours are rare in television. Thank you for trusting us with it." But Razor was barely listening to the professional compliments. His attention was focused on Emma, who was kneeling beside Daisy and accepting the golden retriever's enthusiastic affection. "She's decided she likes me," Emma said, laughing as Daisy attempted to lick her face. "She's a good judge of character," Razor replied, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt like the future might hold something worth looking forward to. 6 months later, the brass plaque beside the shelter's front door gleamed in the morning sun, its polished surface reflecting the words, "The Daisy McKenzie Animal Sanctuary," in elegant script. Below the name, a smaller inscription read, "Where second chances begin with unconditional love." Razor stood back to admire the sign, Daisy sitting patiently beside him as they observed the steady stream of volunteers arriving for another day of work. The shelter had tripled in size since the television interview, expanding into the adjacent building to accommodate the surge in donations and adoptions that had followed their appearance on Sunday Spotlight. What had started as a small local charity had become a regional model for animal rescue and rehabilitation. "Dad, the new therapy room is ready for the ribbon cutting," Emma called from the doorway. She'd relocated her veterinary practice to Cedar Falls permanently, establishing a full-service clinic that specialized in the kind of behavioral therapy work that had made both their careers meaningful. The ceremony was small and personal, attended by the volunteers, board members, and community supporters who'd become family over the past months. Mayor Wilson, who'd initially worried about the political implications of employing an ex-convict, now spoke proudly about Cedar Falls being home to a nationally recognized center for animal rehabilitation. "When I first heard about Tuesday morning's incident," the mayor said to the assembled crowd, "I was concerned about our city's reputation. I worried that controversy would overshadow the good work being done here. But sometimes what looks like a crisis is actually an opportunity in disguise." Tommy Walsh, now 8 and still carrying the same backpack that had scattered its contents that October morning, stepped forward with his mother to cut the ribbon on the new therapy wing. The space was designed specifically for working with traumatized animals, with soft lighting, comfortable seating areas, and specialized equipment that Emma had researched and selected. "This room represents everything this sanctuary stands for," Emma addressed the crowd as Tommy wielded the oversized scissors with ceremonial gravity. "The understanding that healing takes time, that trust must be rebuilt slowly, and that love can overcome even the deepest trauma if we're patient enough to let it work." The ribbon fell away in 2 pieces, and the crowd applauded as the first therapy session participants entered the space. Chester, the pit bull who'd been too traumatized to trust humans when he'd first arrived, now wore a service vest and worked regularly with veterans struggling with PTSD. Faith, the nervous border collie, had become a reading companion for children who found comfort in practicing their skills with a non-judgmental audience. As the official festivities wound down and people began to drift back to their regular Saturday activities, Razor found himself in the shelter's original kennel area with Emma and Sarah. The space that had once housed 40 animals now served as a transitional area for new arrivals, while the permanent residents had moved to larger, more comfortable accommodations in the expanded facility. "I got a call from the state yesterday," Sarah said, settling into one of the plastic chairs they'd arranged in what had become their informal meeting space. "They want to use our rehabilitation program as a model for other shelters across California. Full funding, training support, the works." "That's incredible," Emma said, but Razor noticed the slight tension in her voice. "It is. But it would mean more media attention, more scrutiny, more people wanting to know about our success story. I wanted to check with both of you before I gave them an answer. Razor looked around the kennel area, remembering the morning 3 years ago when Sarah had first handed him a key and trusted him with the responsibility of caring for creatures that couldn't protect themselves. The work had changed him in ways he was still discovering, teaching him that strength could be measured in gentleness, that real power came from service rather than dominance. "What do you think, Em?" he asked his daughter. Emma considered the question with the careful deliberation that characterized her approach to important decisions. "I think healing happens best when it's not performed for an audience, but I also think there are probably thousands of people out there, both animals and humans, who could benefit from what we've learned here. The attention doesn't scare you, not anymore. The story is already out there, and people have made their judgments. The only thing we can control is whether we use that attention to help others or whether we hide from it and miss the opportunity to make a real difference." They were interrupted by the sound of cars in the parking lot, not the media circus that had characterized the weeks following the viral video, but the normal Saturday bustle of families coming to look at animals available for adoption. Through the window, Razor could see a young couple walking toward the entrance, their excitement visible even from a distance. As the afternoon settled into comfortable routine, Emma worked in the clinic while Razor continued his rounds with the dogs. Each walk had become a meditation on the power of consistency and care, each interaction a reminder that healing was possible for anyone willing to do the daily work of choosing hope over despair. "Dad," Emma said as they prepared to lock up that evening, "I've been thinking about your name. You've been Razor for so long that I'd almost forgotten you used to be Marcus. But watching you here, seeing the work you do, I think you've earned the right to choose who you want to be." Razor considered this, looking down at Daisy, who gazed back at him with unwavering acceptance. "I think I'd like to be both, Marcus too. You, because that's who your father always was, underneath everything else. Razor to the people here, because that's the man who learned how to rebuild his life from nothing." As they walked home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, Emma reached into her purse and withdrew a small frame containing the crayon drawing she'd made 20 years ago, the stick figure father and daughter surrounded by hearts, with "Best" Dad ever written across the bottom in red crayon. "I thought you might like to have this back," she said. "It's been true all along. I just needed time to understand what best really meant." Razor took the frame with trembling hands, studying the innocent artwork that had captured a child's unshakable faith in her father's goodness. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying the weight of everything he couldn't articulate. Gratitude for forgiveness he didn't deserve, amazement at the grace that had brought them back together, and wonder at the mysterious ways that love could survive even 20 years of silence. They walked home through streets where children were being tucked into bed and families were settling in for another peaceful evening. It was the kind of ordinary happiness that Razor had once thought was meant for other people, but which now felt as natural and inevitable as Daisy's steady presence at his side. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, animals to heal, programs to develop, the ongoing work of proving that redemption was more than just a beautiful theory. But tonight, Marcus Razor McKenzie walked home with his daughter, carrying a child's drawing that reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten, that love, once given freely, could survive anything, even the worst mistakes a father could make. Behind them, the newly renamed Daisy McKenzie Animal Sanctuary stood quiet and secure, filled with creatures learning to trust again under the patient care of people who understood that second chances weren't just possible, they were miraculous, necessary and available to anyone brave enough to believe they deserved them.